Just before sunrise, an internal memo circulated quietly inside Pentagon that carried a tone far more urgent than its classification label suggested. The memo was concise, but unmistakably serious. It warned that the rapid military integration of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger into a single coordinated structure known as the United Sahel Command could alter the balance of power across West Africa in ways Washington had not anticipated. The document highlighted concerns that the new command might consolidate political will, centralize regional intelligence, and weaken long-established Western influence in a part of the world where instability once provided predictable strategic leverage. For decades, policymakers in Washington assumed the Sahel would remain fragmented, governed by separate military doctrines and divided political trajectories. Yet the emergence of a unified security framework challenged that assumption at its core. The memo suggested that this new command could accelerate independence from traditional partners and reduce reliance on foreign military infrastructures that have shaped the region for years. For older Americans attentive to global shifts, the question was familiar. When a region long defined by crisis suddenly begins acting with coordination rather than chaos, what does it signal about the future? Before diving deeper, consider this. When institutions in Washington quietly express fear, it is rarely about what has happened. It is about what might soon become unavoidable. And the United Sahel Command, according to the memo, represents a new kind of inevitability. If this story leads you to pause even briefly, let that pause guide the next question. What does unity mean in a region where division once defined the rules? And if Washington fears this development, what exactly does it believe is coming next? The internal assessment attached to the memo from the U.S. Department of Defense outlined a far more complex picture of the United Sahel Command than Washington had initially understood. Instead of a loose partnership held together by political necessity, analysts discovered a rapidly maturing structure capable of coordinating military, intelligence, and logistical operations with a level of coherence rarely seen in the region. According to the memo, this new command had already unified multiple surveillance networks into a single intelligence grid and begun pooling drone reconnaissance data into a central hub that allowed cross-border activity to be tracked in near real time. This alone was enough to unsettle senior planners, who for years had relied on fragmented regional capabilities to maintain strategic visibility. But the document went further. It described how engineers within the Sahel had combined limited resources into a unified communications protocol, one that bypassed older systems embedded by foreign partners. Such independence was not merely symbolic. It meant that the United Sahel Command could move personnel, coordinate operations, and respond to threats without external oversight. Analysts warned that this level of operational autonomy could shrink the intelligence footprint that American and European agencies depended on. The memo's authors were especially troubled by unexpected local support. Field reports showed villagers cooperating with joint patrols, farmers sharing information voluntarily, and market communities expressing confidence in the new structure's intentions. The memo highlighted testimony from a resident in northern Burkina Faso who described how coordinated patrols from multiple Sahel nations treated civilians with a level of respect that foreign forces had not always been able to provide. His statement, simple and unpolished, carried weight. He said he finally felt the region was defending itself rather than being defended by outsiders who did not understand its rhythms. For Washington, this was a strategic warning. Legitimacy on the ground can shift power more effectively than weapons. The memo laid out several implications. A unified command would reduce the Sahel's dependence on foreign training, weaken long-established counter-terror protocols built around Western leadership, and grant African leaders the leverage to negotiate partnerships on equal footing. The authors noted that the Sahel was no longer behaving like a collection of countries pressured by crisis, but like a coordinated bloc capable of shaping its own geopolitical identity. The concern was not that the United Sahel Command would become hostile. It was that it could become truly sovereign. With sovereignty came the ability to decline foreign basing agreements, redirect economic corridors, or align with global actors who might challenge American interests. The document suggested that this transition had occurred far faster than predicted, prompting speculation that one or more external powers may have encouraged the command's development. Although no nation was named directly, the memo's language hinted that analysts believed strategic competitors may have quietly supported technological upgrades and logistical integration. The final pages of the assessment made clear that Washington's fear was not rooted in the command's current capabilities, but in its trajectory. A unified doctrine, unified intelligence, unified logistics, and growing public trust formed the foundation for something the memo called a strategic leap, a moment when a region historically shaped by outside influence would begin shaping its own alliances and security architecture. Yet the memo ended with a cryptic line suggesting that the command's next move would not merely redefine local security, but alter the wider balance of power, leaving one pressing question hanging unanswered. Who, if anyone, had guided the Sahel toward unity at a pace that even Washington had failed to anticipate? Inside the briefing rooms of the Pentagon, the release of the internal memo ignited a wave of urgency that few officials anticipated. As analysts projected maps of the United Sahel Command's expanding coordination network onto the wall, a quiet realization settled over the room. The Sahel was no longer operating as a collection of vulnerable states. It was moving like a single organism with a shared purpose and a growing sense of identity. Some senior advisors warned that intelligence gaps were widening faster than Washington's ability to adjust. Others argued that this was not merely a military evolution, but a psychological shift that could redefine the region's relationship with every foreign actor involved there. The memo's classification was urgent for good reason. It documented rising civilian support for the command, intelligence officers who no longer prioritized Western requests, and a pattern of coordinated operations that suggested a unified long-term strategy rather than reactive crisis management. The strongest reaction came from policymakers who remembered earlier decades when unity in certain parts of the world altered American priorities overnight. A few even compared the Sahel's trajectory to past movements that began modestly, but later grew powerful enough to reshape global alliances. Yet outside Washington, the emotional response took an entirely different form. Throughout Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger communities began speaking openly of a new regional identity, one rooted not in colonial traces or international dependency, but in synchronized action and shared sacrifice. In a small village outside Niamey, A teacher recounted how soldiers from different Sahel nations worked side by side to rebuild a school wall damaged by violent clashes years earlier. She said she had never seen that kind of cooperation before, and believed it signaled a future where the region could finally stand without leaning on foreign structures. Her voice carried across local radio and was repeated in markets, mosques, and homes. For Washington, this was perhaps the most alarming development. The memo emphasized that once public sentiment aligns with a unified command, influence based on historical ties quickly loses relevance. Meanwhile, European partners expressed confusion as their own intelligence frameworks struggled to track the command's rapid evolution. Some hinted privately that they were unprepared for an Africa that spoke collectively rather than through fragmented channels. A diplomat in Brussels noted that the Sahel's new military coherence could eventually translate into political leverage across the continent, shifting long-established patterns of negotiation. The intensity of reactions reached a peak when a second internal briefing circulated, summarizing field interviews from Sahel officers who described a profound change in morale. One officer in Ouagadougou reportedly said that for the first time in his career, he felt part of something larger than his own national uniform. He believed the region was fighting for a shared future rather than temporary survival. According to the memo, this emotional transformation was more dangerous to foreign influence than any new weapon system. Morale, when unified, becomes strategy, and strategy, when rooted in shared belief, becomes difficult for outside powers to counter or redirect. The memo also warned that regional unity was accelerating faster than expected. Joint training facilities were being planned, intelligence academies were being discussed, supply routes were being redesigned to prioritize internal resilience rather than external approval. For Washington, this suggested a future where access to key intelligence corridors could shrink dramatically. Yet what truly heightened tension was a final set of interviews with Western field officers who admitted they no longer understood the command's long-term vision. They could track its growth, but not its destination. And uncertainty in geopolitics is often more destabilizing than opposition. If nations once defined by struggle begin acting with coordinated purpose, the world must reconsider its assumptions about what comes next. But the most unsettling detail emerged in the memo's closing paragraph, which referenced a strategic initiative the command had not yet announced publicly, an initiative analysts believed could redefine the Sahel's military and political identity in a single stroke. And Washington feared it would arrive sooner than anyone was prepared to handle. Across the Sahel, the emergence of the United Sahel Command began reshaping daily life in ways that caught the attention of Washington far more quickly than any battlefield report. What alarmed analysts was not the size of the command or its growing logistical strength. It was the quiet shift in how ordinary people described their world. In towns once marked by fear, families reported hearing fewer gunshots at night. Roads long considered too dangerous for travel reopened as joint patrols established steady routines. In Gao, a father of 4 explained that for the first time in years he could let his children walk to the well before sunrise without fear of being caught between rival factions. His voice shook when he said it, not out of emotion, but disbelief. Such small changes carried profound political weight. According to the memo circulating inside the Pentagon, these improvements strengthened public trust in ways foreign partners had never fully achieved, despite decades of intervention. The memo warned that stability created from within carries a moral authority that external actors struggle to influence. Once civilians begin to associate safety with local leadership rather than foreign presence, the political balance shifts dramatically. And that shift had already begun. Governments within the AES coalition capitalized on this momentum. With new confidence, leaders proposed a unified procurement program to reduce reliance on Western suppliers and began coordinating intelligence academies that would train future analysts using homegrown doctrines rather than imported frameworks. These moves signaled a transition from tactical cooperation to strategic self-definition. Meanwhile, regional diplomacy took on a sharper tone. Nations outside the coalition watched the developments with careful calculation. Some, like Ghana, questioned whether aligning with the command would yield long-term stability or provoke tension with existing Western partners. Others quietly explored dialogue with the command, sensing the early rise of a new regional power structure. European governments faced an even more difficult dilemma. For years, their relationships with West African states relied on a predictable imbalance of capability. But the command's rapid competence threatened to rewrite the terms of engagement. A minister in Brussels admitted privately that Europe could soon lose the ability to shape outcomes in a region it once treated as an extension of its own security perimeter. Yet the most important consequences continued unfolding at the community level. In a small settlement near Mopti, a market vendor explained how a joint patrol from 3 Sahel nations visited her village to address concerns about harassment along a trade route. She said the officers listened. They asked questions. They returned days later with a concrete plan to secure the area. She said she had seen foreign soldiers before, but this was the first time she felt the region was protecting itself. Washington analysts flagged statements like hers as indicators that the Sahel was experiencing not just political reorganization, but a cultural shift toward shared identity. That shift, according to the memo, could harden into a form of regional nationalism capable of resisting external influence. For the United States, this raised critical concerns about intelligence access, counter-terror cooperation, and diplomatic leverage. A unified Sahel with strong public backing could decline Beijing agreements, renegotiate partnerships from a position of strength, or pivot toward global actors less aligned with American interests. This possibility prompted urgent discussions inside Washington. Some advisors argued that the United States should embrace the command's rise and redefine its role as a supportive partner. Others feared that empowering regional autonomy could weaken long-standing networks and create unpredictable vulnerabilities. The memo did not take a position, but it did deliver a warning. As civilian confidence continued to deepen, the United Sahel Command was approaching what analysts called an irreversible threshold, a moment when the region's new military identity would become permanent. And according to the final lines of the Pentagon memo, that threshold may be crossed when the command announces its next initiative, a move analysts believe could redraw the political map of West Africa in a single decisive step, leaving Washington uncertain of how much time it still has to react. Inside Washington, the assessment of the United Sahel Command shifted from cautious observation to urgent strategic recalibration. Analysts across the U.S. Department of Defense concluded that the command represented more than regional cooperation. It marked the emergence of a political and military identity capable of acting independently of foreign direction. The Pentagon memo noted that a unified Sahel could eventually manage its own intelligence corridors, secure its borders without Western frameworks, and negotiate international partnerships without relying on traditional allies. This possibility unsettled policymakers who had long assumed that fragmentation in the region would preserve familiar lines of influence. European allies expressed similar unease. Leaders in Paris and Brussels recognized that a confident Sahel, organized under a single doctrine, could renegotiate security agreements, alter migration pathways, and recalibrate energy partnerships. Diplomats warned that Europe's leverage in Africa was weakening, not because of adversarial nations, but because African nations were beginning to rely on one another instead of on Europe. Beyond Europe, the reaction varied. Some Middle Eastern and Asian powers saw opportunity, anticipating that the Sahel's new posture might allow alternative partnerships to flourish. Others questioned whether the command would seek new alliances or maintain strict regional autonomy. For Washington, the greater concern lay in the geopolitical vacuum such a shift could create. If the United States misread the Sahel's intentions, it risked losing strategic visibility in a corridor critical to counter-terror operations and global stability. Yet the memo emphasized that the command's rise was not driven by hostility, but by necessity. Years of instability had forged a collective determination to protect civilians, rebuild institutions, and reclaim agency. And in that determination, Washington saw both promise and risk. Promise because a stable Sahel could reduce the long-standing burden of crisis response. Risk because a sovereign Sahel would choose its partners on its own terms. The memo ended with a stark reminder. Influence is not lost through conflict. It is lost when people no longer need it. And as analysts examined the final section of the memo, they warned that the next decision by the United Sahel Command could trigger a realignment that reshapes not only West Africa, but the global order built around it. As the implications of the Pentagon memo settled across Washington, a quiet but unmistakable truth began to emerge. The United Sahel Command was not a temporary coalition or an experiment in regional coordination. It was the first real expression of a collective identity formed from years of hardship, resilience, and a determination to secure a future without dependency. For policymakers accustomed to viewing the Sahel through the lens of crisis, this shift felt unsettling. For families across West Africa who had endured uncertainty for decades, it felt like the first hint of long overdue dignity. The memo warned that if the command continued strengthening its internal structures, it could soon rewrite the region's diplomatic landscape, altering which partners shaped West African security and which no longer held the influence they once assumed. The document also urged leaders to consider the human dimension. Behind every policy shift were mothers who longed for safer roads, elders who wished for a future free from fear, and young men and women who believed unity might finally succeed where outside intervention had fallen short. For older Americans who have watched global orders rise and fall across their lifetime, the message was familiar. When ordinary people choose to walk forward with shared purpose, history often bends in their direction. The question now is whether the world will recognize that the Sahel's transformation is driven not by ambition, but by necessity. The necessity of communities who have grown tired of waiting for others to secure their future. If this story has caused you to reflect on justice, self-determination, and the fragile balance between influence and independence, let that reflection stay with you. It is through reflection that we understand not only what is changing, but why it matters. And as the memo's final paragraph hinted, the United Sahel Command may soon take a step that crosses from regional coordination into full structural autonomy, a step Washington fears could redefine alliances across 2 continents. The question that remains is simple, yet profound. When that moment arrives, who will be prepared for the new world that follows?